So before I introduce Nancy Booker, and she can introduce everyone on the panel, this is the biggest panel. Africa is the biggest continent, so we have to make allowances for that. And I hope no one fact checks me on that one. But really, I'm going to hand over to you, Nancy, and good luck, and let's go.
Thank you very much, Michael. The panel is going to be looking at developments across the global south and looking at Africa. I am honored to moderate this panel of, great minds from different African countries, and you'll be hearing from them just how different we are, as far as media sustainability is concerned. I'll introduce them in a bit, but the focus of this panel is basically looking at the fact that media sustainability and public interests journalism across Africa predates dominance of digital platform companies. The media economies in the continent have long struggled with media viability, and it's increasingly evident that pre-existing financial challenges have been exacerbated by big tech. So the panelists will be sharing their experiences from, their countries, discussing sustainability challenges, and of course, exploring solutions of Africa's largest media markets. We are drawn from Kenya. We have Churchill Otieno, who's the executive director of the East African Editors Society, sitting right in the middle. He's a former president of the Kenya Editors Guild. He's Kenyan, but right now has an East African mandate. We have Pamela Sitoni also from Kenya, who's a group managing editor at the Nation Media Group in Kenya. I think earlier on somebody was, teasing her that it's the largest media group in, East Africa. So I hope that her discussion will highlight what that actually means and whether it is still big. Then we have Lassina Serme, president of the Network of Online Press Professionals of Côte d'Ivoire. You want to wave so that they know who you are? Great. We have Tidiane, right at the end, who's a founder for Questef News and director of Edgicom from Senegal. Great to have you. We have with us Editan Ojo. Did I pronounce that right?
Yeah.
Close. Okay. Executive Director, Media Rights Agenda from Nigeria. And lastly, we have Sulemana Braimah, the Executive Director, Media Foundation for West Africa in Ghana, joining us virtually. Okay. So I'm just going to invite the panel as they make the opening remarks. And I really want to thank Zoe. I can't see her in the room, but I think her presentation, set the stage for the discussion that we're going to have. In her address, she looked at, different countries across the continent, the African continent, and where they are. And the panel basically extends that conversation. So as we start this conversation, I invite the panelists to, describe, their current challenges facing the media houses in their respective countries. And, as you do that, also just focusing on, the role that big tech has played in, exacerbating some of these challenges, or helping in addressing some of the, providing some of the solutions, if at all. And I think we will start with TDN right at the end from Senegal.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me joining this conversation. I don't know how we're going to manage to have the people keep alive. That would be a toast for our moderator, I think, after a long day. To talk about Senegal, and I believe for that's probably the same for several countries as we've been hearing since this morning. I believe where the big tech really harm us is they take our readership. They take our advertising money. That's what everybody says. But what a lot of people do not say, and what we do not really think about, is they also take a bit of the essence and soul of this job, this profession. Because of the existence of these platforms, we have a lot of people who now call themselves journalists, content providers, content creators, and who compete with us. You go in a crowd like this in Senegal today, you might have maybe 10, 20, at times 50% of the people, you would wonder whether they're journalists or not. Because the way they work and the way I work or my other professional colleagues work is totally different. Where you have ethics and standards to respect, they don't care, but they have the platform. And at times, they have bigger audiences, because while you are there, busy waiting to see, oh, can I publish this? Should I publish this? They just need a snippet, put it online, and there you go. So I think the discussion about the money is interesting. The discussion about the readership, the audience is interesting, but we should add a point about the soul and essence of this profession. I think for me, that's really key, particularly if you're someone like me who has been doing journalism all his life and who continues to do journalism. So that's just something I wanted to have as an introduction point before even getting into the details of what the situation in Senegal is. In Senegal, and then it would come back to those numbers, those statistics. I recently, through the school I lead, led a research paper in collaboration with VITS. I think some of them are here, called State of the Newsroom. Mm-hmm. And there are some interesting indications that came out of that study. For instance, 85% of journalists say they need social media. They use it as a source of information, or they use it as tools. So something it's very, very, very interesting number. Another interesting figure that we have, 73.6% of the media professionals work in a media house that have tried to go online, that was legacy media that have created online media platforms trying to catch up with what's happening. Because people are trying to compete with those people who are online, who are providing news, and who are getting advertising revenue while the media's advertising revenue is shrinking. So, somebody was, I think in earlier conversation was saying, yes, the numbers, what do they mean, those numbers? If you're in a country of 17 million and 2.5 million people follow Facebook, it means Facebook has more followers than the biggest newspaper in Senegal. This is the way we should think. It's not, the number can be very small. 2.5 million followers on Facebook in Senegal. You might say, well, out of 17 million people, it's nothing. But when you bring it to the media sector and you realize that the most selling newspaper does not go beyond 100,000 copies, and that is when I exaggerate. This is what it means. And what else does it mean? That platform has a national reach and a global reach. It means for the small company trying to sell Senegalese shoes and want to sell it also in Mali and other neighboring countries, instead of going to that small newspaper with 3,000 copies, they would go to Facebook. They have the 2.5 million of Facebook. Some of them are Senegalese, but they can also have other users in other countries. So it's so complex and so tricky that it's not the numbers. It is what's beyond the numbers. How do we read the numbers? So I believe I have other numbers. I don't know how much time we would have for those first introductory remarks. But I think it's good that we have a wider perspective at looking at those things. The other important problem is the social political context. Usually when you talk about Senegal, people would say, you are in a free and democratic country, freedom of expression is respected, and so on and so forth. So it means even if those grants come, at times people might say, oh, this is not a country with problems. This is not a country with, this is not a failed state. This is not a country with a dictatorship where independent media cannot survive.
Okay.
For having been trying to promote independent, and when I say independent, I truly mean independent media for the past 15 years, I know what it means to be in such context where people believe that you don't have challenges because you're living in a free and democratic society. Maybe I can discuss those further if we have a chance to have questions, or if you have a chance to get back to me, so that I don't monopolize.
Thank you. Thank you very much, TDN. Ojo, do you want to take it on from there?
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. So I'm from Nigeria, as I was introduced, and for me, really, the Nigerian situation presents something of an irony, really. In a country that is estimated to have over 200 million people, I mean, you would think that even if you were selling toilet paper as newspaper, you couldn't go wrong. The market is there. But unfortunately, we just haven't been able to convert that population into a media market. And the media was there long before the telecom industry and big tech came along. And whilst we kept telling ourselves that, oh, the level of poverty is so high that people cannot afford newspapers and so on and so forth, the moment telecom came in, those poor people put their money into it. So we need to ask ourselves seriously, is it that as a community, as a media community, we have not been able to sell the value of what we do to our populations such that they're not willing to invest their money into it? I know that there is a variety of problems and it's probably more sophisticated than I'm painting, but I think we need to ask ourselves these kinds of questions before we start looking out externally, because these markets were always there before big tech came, and we just couldn't convert the market, but they came and they converted the market. People would use basically their last dollar to buy credit or data on their phone because they could see the value of it in their lives. Have we been able to sell the value of news and information to our societies? And I think that that's a critical question that we need to ask. But the other challenge we face, I said Nigeria is a country estimated to have over 200 million. That in itself is extremely problematic. Why are we estimating Nigeria's population? Why don't we have a figure to say that this is the population of Nigeria? And within the media, we're not asking this question. Why is it that Nigeria is not able to count its people and say this is how many we are and plan accordingly? Because if we can't, if we don't know how many we are, how are we going to plan and develop that country? So you look at all of these and then you wonder, are we really surprised that as a sector we're failing, at least in the Nigerian context? So I just thought I should start with that so that we don't go on this bashing spree of big tech to make ourselves feel good, whilst we are not also interrogating some of the relevant issues that we need to talk about and address. The media environment in Nigeria is extremely challenging for many different reasons. And the challenge of sustainability is not new. It's not something that has emerged over the last few years since big tech came around. It was always there. There is no doubt that things have been aggravated by big tech, but the problem was there before they came. And in this environment, we find that the media sector is really losing out at a speed that is alarming, to the extent that many media organizations are no longer able to pay staff salaries. I know that when some people hear it, they can't wrap their heads around the idea that, you have workers that you are not paying salaries to, and they continue to work. And I tell you, there are media organizations where people have worked for more than 1 year without earning a salary. So you ask yourself, what kind of journalism are they likely to be producing in that kind of environment? Is it one that would be so compelling that, people will put their money into it without hesitation? So again, those sort of issues, I think that we are compelled to ask. But what that has also resulted in is that we have a lot of media organizations that are laying off workers. And then there are those others that are not waiting to be laid off. They are leaving themselves. So a lot of, star journalists become image makers to politicians, to corporate bodies, and so on. And if you are a journalist with pride and you become an image maker for a politician, you can just imagine the humiliation you go through every day, every waking moment of your life, because you know that you have no credibility. You're using all your skills and resources to launder the image of people you would probably, if you were doing your job, taking to the cleaners on a daily basis. So that's part of the challenge and ironies that we're confronted with in this environment. And then there are those who are leaving the information sector completely. They've become traders and they're selling all sorts of things, second-hand clothing and so on, because the journalism as a profession is no longer able to sustain them. And they have a life, they have families, they have bills to pay. So those are some of the factors that we're seeing in this sorry state of the media in Nigeria.
Okay.
But just also to quickly say, some of the challenges have arisen from a failure of governance. And I think we bear some responsibility for that as well. But we operate in an environment where there's really no public infrastructure to support media activities. You don't have reliable electricity. So imagine a broadcast station doing 24 hours operations with no electricity supply or no expectation of electricity supply. It's difficult. When you set up your own power generation system, that wipes out, all your resources. So, and then you look at newspapers that are hardly able to distribute copies of newspapers across a very large country. So the traditional distribution system we have in Nigeria, you put a few hundred copies in a vehicle, send it from the southern part of the country to the northern part. It makes no sense. I mean, the number of newspapers you're transporting to another location to say, even if you sold all of them and made a profit, it wouldn't cover your cost of getting the newspapers there. So you have all these kinds of contradictions and ironies that just means that the media is bound to fail. And I think that we really need to systematically look at these issues, try and address them, while we also figure out how to attract additional resources to the sector through BTEC, for instance. Let me share that for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Ojo. I'll go to Pam, because as you were speaking, she kept on turning towards my direction and smiling, because I think she just said, well, I don't know why she was smiling. I'm not going to speak for her. So Pam, why were you smiling?
Thank you, Prof, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm really honored to be here, and thank you, Michael, for having me on the panel. So why was I smiling? Because I'm one of those people who really tell people that Africa is not one country and every situation is different. But just listening to my brother from Nigeria, we are clearly living in one country in Africa. So that's why I was smiling. So, Prof, if you had asked me about the situation of media in Kenya about 5-7 years ago, I'd have told you it's vibrant, very successful business, very free media. Well, things over the last 10 years have become the other way. For the first time in my history as a journalist, and it's a long one, I actually see media houses, very legacy media houses, unable to pay salaries of their staff. The very successful model of advertising and circulation revenues driving media houses has completely failed. We've seen revenues shrink by up to 50% in the last 10 years. And it continues to go down so fast that it's a worry that if we don't do something urgently, we might not really have much of a media in Kenya soon. So I know there are all these other issues, and I also know that media houses are making every effort to make revenue out of their digital platforms. But since the conversation here was really about the big tech, I just looked at what the numbers are telling us. And in Kenya, for example, according to PwC, advertising on internet overtook advertising in newspapers and advertising on TV in 2021. And by 2026, advertising on internet will be more than the two sectors combined, TV and broadcast combined. And then I spoke to somebody from a finance department in a media house I shall not name, and asked him, how much revenue do we get from the big tech companies that place a lot of adverts on our platforms? Actually, majority of the ads on our digital platforms are from the big tech companies. And he told me it's 0.36% of the revenues. So for me, this just underlines what we are talking about here, that we have the big tech that is literally eating our lunch, but paying us hardly anything for it. And we have to really have a conversation with them. And we've had a lot spoken here about the role of media in fostering democracy, in protecting democracy in our countries. That is all true. But I think I dare say that these big tech companies also, they need us just as much as we need them. They need us, and we need to have that conversation, because if we do not have a thriving independent media in Africa or in our respective countries, they cannot also be trusted sources of information for the people who go to them for information. So we need each other. And I don't think it should be an adversarial relationship where we are accusing each other, but we need to start talking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pam. Sulemana, you still with us? Okay.
Yes.
So what's the situation in Ghana?
Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon to colleagues. It's unfortunate I couldn't get my visa in time to be able to join you in person. Well, just to take it from where the previous speaker ended, in terms of saying that we appear to live on the same continent in terms of the challenges and all of that, I don't think that the situation in Ghana and in most of the other countries in West Africa is different from what colleagues have already shared. In terms of colleagues from either West Africa or East Africa, I think the situation is quite peculiar. And given time limitation, I just want to perhaps dwell on 3 issues and then share what I think going forward we need to include in our conversation. About 2 years ago, some folks reached out to me, and these were people working with Google News. And essentially, their engagement with me was about trying to verify the authenticity of some media outlets that had applied to seek resources from Google under the Google News initiative. But their other problem really was that this was a call that was targeting Sub-Saharan Africa. And unfortunately, they didn't seem to have quite a number of applications, contrary to their expectations and contrary to their experiences elsewhere, in terms of when they put out a call and it is for Europe, Middle East, Americas, they are overwhelmed with applications. And here was a case where we have struggling media outlets in Africa, and they put out a call, and the applications are quite few. Well, first of all, in our region in West Africa, I think there was one application from Niger, one from Burkina Faso, and there was one from Cameroon that they were considering. So they asked me, why do I think that the applications were so few from sub-Saharan Africa? And I said, well, it is because a lot of our people perhaps don't even understand how do they meet the expectations that Google has for this application? Because news outlets are supposed to indicate how they are going to use innovative apps, innovative tech, in order to increase their audience share and to develop revenue streams and all of that. The reality is that most of our newsrooms in this part of the world don't have that capacity. And so in terms of the exploitation that is ongoing, or the problems that we are talking about in terms of the role of big tech, the challenge is that the capacity is not even there for people to appreciate the exploitation that is happening and how to respond to that. And I believe it's important that we acknowledge that as one of the critical things, because even if we have a legislative framework that is supposed to compel these big tech organizations to share revenues or increase revenues to these media organizations, they may not even have the technical capability to be able to respond and to be eligible. Now, that takes me to the second point I want to make in relation to what we call big tech. I think it's also important for us to not perhaps focus only on big tech in the context of Facebook, Google, Microsoft, and so on, but to also look at entities that I would call the local big techs, whose activities are also impacting mainstream media in terms of viability. And I would want to just give an example. Here in Ghana, the biggest telecom operator is MTN, and I believe they are among the biggest in a number of countries. Now, not only are they big within the telecommunications space, over the years, they've also been one of the biggest advertisers for media, and so one of the biggest sources of revenue for media outlets. Now, over time, what is happening is that MTN now is deploying applications that are basically content production. So in Ghana, for example, we have an app called Ayuba, which is an MTN app, and it's not only just an app, it is a platform for creating content, a platform for distributing content, and this content is being distributed zero rated. In other words, people don't have to suffer data cost for accessing these materials. The implication is that they become a direct competitor to media outlets, and not only that, if they can reach out to the people directly, why would they have to advertise and pay money to other media organizations before they get their content out there? So the activities of local big technology companies is something that we also have to look at. Now, the third point I want to make is what perhaps Zoe talked about in terms of the capacity of some countries to be able to come up with pieces of legislation that would even compel these big tech organizations to play ball. Our boss edits, Big Brother edits from Nigeria. Nigeria is such a big player, and I'm sure that Google or Facebook cannot easily ignore Nigeria if Nigeria decides that, look, we are introducing a policy like this to help our media ecosystem. But how about Burkina Faso? How about Niger? How about Seychelles, as Zoe said? These are countries that I'm sure these big tech companies can simply say, to hell with you, we would pull out. And the implications could be dire politically for these countries, because citizens would begin to agitate. They would want their Facebook back. They would want their Twitter back. And therefore, governments may not be able to meaningfully negotiate and bargain for what will help their media organizations to be viable. Under the circumstances, I would propose that in Africa, for example, the AU has a big role to play. If we are looking at a continental approach, perhaps it has to be through AU. But beyond AU, we can also look at the regional economic blocks. The ECOWAS, which is the Economic Bloc for West Africa, for example, has the ECOWAS Anti-Competition Authority, which is a regional authority set up to ensure that there is fair play and no, competitive advantages are being taken by big players. How do we engage entities like that to appreciate the importance of dealing within the media space and ensuring that all these conversations about what big tech is doing can be taken on board? Because in our part of the world, single countries may not be able to have the muscle to negotiate and engage. And then finally, and related to that, is the point about inclusion, which I believe is one of the principles that we are talking about. Therefore, instead of maybe looking at a South African model, a Ghanaian model, a Nigerian model, perhaps we should be looking at, as I said, a continental model that would leave no one behind. Because I believe that if the South African media ecosystem becomes viable and the Ghanaian ones and the Nigerian ones are still struggling, the impact on Africa will remain the same. And so those are the reflections that I would want to share at this stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Lassina, as the president of the Network of Online Press Professionals, is the situation the same for you in Senegal? In Côte d'Ivoire, sorry?
Oui, merci. Je voudrais d'abord merci Michael à l'ensemble des membres du comité d'organisation pour cette aimable invitation pour partager avec l'ensemble des participants de haute qualité ici votre expérience de secteur around to us. Pour parler de la presse de façon globale, il faut noter que la situation est très dramatique en Côte d'Ivoire. Il y a 5 ans de cela, où l'ensemble des journaux imprimés avaient un chiffre d'affaires d'environ plus de 3 milliards de francs CFA. Mais les derniers chiffres officiels qui ont été donnés font état de moins de 1 milliard de chiffre d'affaires en 2022. Donc cela dénote déjà cette situation morose du point de vue économique donc de la presse en Côte d'Ivoire. Et aujourd'hui, l'un des indicateurs montre que nous sommes dans le volet numérique au même niveau que la presse imprimée dans les années 90. Il y a eu ce qu'on appelait chez nous le printemps de la presse. Donc au lendemain du multipartisme, il y a eu une flopée, une floraison de médias, de journaux qui ont été créés. Et aujourd'hui, nous observons la même tendance au niveau du numérique. Et justement, parlant du numérique, il y a de cela 5 ans, précisément en 2017, que la loi a intégré la presse en ligne. Sinon, la loi sur la presse ne prenait pas en compte la presse en ligne. Et avec le plaidoyer qui a été fait par les différentes organisations, dont la nôtre, la nouvelle loi a pris, n'est-ce pas, la presse en ligne en compte. Donc désormais, la presse en ligne est régulée du point de vue éditorial et régulée du point de vue économique par les autorités de régulation. Et en Côte d'Ivoire, nous en avons 2. L'autorité de régulation de la presse imprimée et des productions d'informations numériques et l'autorité de régulation de l'audiovisuel qui va s'occuper des web télé, des web radios, des radios classiques, etc., etc. Mais sauf que dans ce dispositif juridique, il n'y a pas de disposition qui contraignent les différents opérateurs, ceux que nous appelons les GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon et Microsoft, à pouvoir reverser quelque chose à ces médias. Parce que nous observons un détournement de la publicité à travers donc la publicité programmatique. Aujourd'hui, les annonceurs préfèrent aller directement voir ces géants de l'Internet pour placer leur publicité en fonction donc de la cible. Donc du coup, les médias classiques perdent une part extrêmement importante au niveau donc de la publicité. Ça, c'est un élément. Le deuxième élément, il y a les GAFAM locaux. On a par exemple ce qu'on appelle Opera News, il y a Scooper, il y a Phoenix, qui pillent les contenus donc des producteurs d'informations numériques sans le moindre sou. Donc, il passe par l'intelligence artificielle. Dès que vous publiez un article, automatiquement, le serveur de ces intelligences artificielles récupère votre production, votre information, et qui est donc visible sur les smartphones un peu partout. Donc, du coup, ça aussi, ça devient un grand manque à gagner. Mais seulement qu'il y a un vide au niveau donc, de la loi qui ne fait pas obligation à ces grands groupes locaux, n'est-ce pas, à payer et à reverser quelque chose aux médias. Donc ça, c'est l'un des défis. Et pour essayer d'aider les médias, l'État a mis en place une agence de soutien de développement des médias, ASDM, qui prend en compte donc les médias privés, seulement que les médias privés. Mais encore là, c'est difficile parce que l'État va subventionner sur un temps, mais pas sur tout le temps. Par exemple, au niveau de la presse imprimée, il y a eu un moment où l'État a pris en charge l'impression des journaux. Mais ça a duré sur 6 mois. Et juste après donc ces 6 mois, on est retombé dans les mêmes difficultés. Les journaux n'arrivent pas à aller à l'imprimerie, les journaux n'arrivent pas à bien vendre, donc les journaux n'arrivent pas à assumer les charges de leur fonctionnement. Donc ça, c'est le deuxième défi au niveau donc de la Côte d'Ivoire. Et ce que notre organisation propose, c'est qu'on puisse aller en ensemble géographique. Parce que nos pays, pris individuellement, ne peuvent pas gagner ce combat. La Côte d'Ivoire, nous sommes à environ 30 millions d'habitants. Donc face à ces GAFAM, c'est vraiment rien, c'est une goutte d'eau dans la mer. Donc on ne pourra jamais gagner ce combat en négociant de façon individuelle. Donc le plaidoyer qu'on fait, c'est d'amener nos États à se saisir de la question, d'abord au niveau sous-régional. On a ce qu'on appelle l'UEMOA, l'Union économique et monétaire ouest-africaine, qui regroupe en règle générale les parties, les pays de l'Afrique francophone. Et au-delà, il y a la CEDEAO, qui compte un peu plus d'une quinzaine de pays. Donc, dans l'espace CEDEAO, par exemple, on a plus de 300 millions d'habitants. Donc, voyez-vous que ce chiffre devient un peu important pour aller négocier, négocier avec ces grands pays. Donc, pour nous, c'est essentiel. Donc, le combat que nous menons maintenant, c'est d'amener nos politiques, nos gouvernements à prendre à bras le corps le phénomène de sorte à pouvoir légiférer là-dessus et amener la question au niveau sous-régional et continental, comme Sulemana l'a dit, au niveau donc de l'Union africaine. Voilà ce que je voulais dire très rapidement en guise d'introduction.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oops. Okay, I don't know what's happening there. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you, Lesina, for that. And, you know, Churchill, you get the last word on this before we open it up for questions from the panel. Lesina and Sulemana have challenged us and said, you know, negotiating individually doesn't work. That we have to come together to collectively negotiate with big tech companies. And as the executive director of the Eastern African Editors Society, you know, would this be the place that we look to as one of those professional associations that can represent media outlets? Because Courtney, I think, who's in the room, you know, says that successfully implementing policies requires strong institutions, professional associations that can represent media outlets and facilitate bargaining. Is this one place that we can look to?
Thank you. Am I audible? Can I be heard? Yeah, thank you. The question of big tech and journalism, I think, is a most opportune one. And I think, Michael, thank you. And GIBS, thanks very much for giving us this chance to have this conversation. But to answer that question, one probably needs to appreciate the landscape that we find ourselves in, especially those of us who have to operate in the global south and more so Africa. When I reflect on the first conversation this morning, the first panel, that was mostly about how these went down in the mature markets, it comes out clearly that what we are talking about essentially is a three-way negotiation where we have the media on one side, we have the platforms, but we also have government. And in their case, their governments fully appreciated the need and place for a strong and independent media. I don't think that obtains for us, for the Global South, and for Africa particularly. And I think colleagues who've been in the panels before us made that, were able to bring out a lot more clearly. But that then invites us to maybe ask ourselves, as we walk into this negotiation, what cards do the platforms, what cards does the big tech have that they may exercise, they may play on us with, recognizing the situation we are in? And one card particularly stands out for me. When I look at most African countries, many of them tend to be more dictatorial than they are democratic. So as we walk on to that table, is there something the platforms may offer them that they appreciate a lot more than they do a free media? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. For example, when I think about state security and the power of personal data that these platforms have, and they're able to then use that to exert and extract certain benefits out of that bargaining chip. And I just see that it's increasingly difficult for us to walk out with something meaningful. But we need to appreciate that reality, that because it is what we are working with. The second key question for me, as we look at that landscape, is the whole question around innovation. When I talk to colleagues in different newsrooms across Eastern Africa, but also in many newsrooms across Africa, one common thread seems to be that the conversation around how to reorganize journalism, how to reorganize newsrooms, how to reorganize media businesses in those internal spaces tend to be heavily skewed towards or heavily driven by colleagues in finance and colleagues in marketing. And that the journalism voice, the journalism power is much diluted when it comes to those questions. So that when we come back and look at these questions in terms of public trust and in terms of the value of journalism to the public, that reality is much eroded in terms of reimagining how else could news media, for that matter, make money in our spaces. And the more we come up with the measures and products that speak less to public interest and more to bottom lines, the more we then also end up losing audience trust or public trust, so to speak. And that then leads me to the third question. And this third question was brought fairly dramatically for me over lunch when I had a conversation with Professor Franz Kluger. I hope he's still in the room. And he told me of the King's Guidelines in South Africa, that basically invites corporates and businesses to think of the triple bottom line. That a bottom line for a sustainable enterprise is not just about the financials, but it also has to do with the social impact that entity is able to deliver, but also the environmental impacts that entity is able to deliver. So I think maybe there's a lesson for us there. What might we learn and what traditions could we then endear amongst our journalism and journalism entities to make sure that as we deliver as enterprises, we don't just report that delivery or performance in terms of financials, but we also do so in terms of a social dimension, but also the environmental ones, just to help us grow trust with audiences over time. But to speak specifically to your question, ultimately, I think the only way out, one, is to recognize that advertising as a source of supporting journalism has grown weak, is completely fragmented, and chance is that the good old days aren't coming back. Advertising will continue to be a small part of the revenues that we get moving forward. So that even as we negotiate with the big tech, even as we negotiate with the platforms, maybe that should only be an interim relief. But we need to consider what are the long-term ways in which we can then sustain revenues for journalism. But secondly, how then do we organize ourselves, be it us as journalists or be it us as media investors, to make sure that we're able to organize and negotiate as an industry as opposed to as individuals. And I think then cross-national organizations then become very, very critical. There might be opportunity for us to find ways in which journalists, but also media owners operate and organize at a continental level. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, there's been quite a bit of struggle with the ESC in East Africa in just getting us to some common understanding. And do you see this happening within the East Africa Editors Society?
The way these questions go, there has to be a first mover. Yeah, there has to be a first mover. A few probably individuals. I think we had that also in the first panel. One or two people will get the courage to move forward and hopefully then endear and build confidence amongst the others to follow suit. I don't think there'll be quick answers to it. And the only way, as I say, the only way of knowing is the proof of the eating is it. Proof of the pudding is in the eating. Somebody must test and try some of these issues. And I think in East Africa, the Eastern Africa Editor Society is willing to step forward and carry that mandate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Churchill. I think in the interest of time, we will now open it up for questions from the audience. We have 1, 2, 3 hands. I hope you can see them all. 4. So we'll take the 4 questions in one round.
Thank you so much for the very fruitful interventions and conversation. You mentioned something about revenue and that advertisements are becoming less of a component that one can rely on. When you say back to the good old days, does that mean that political sponsors and powerful political factions will become much more influential, especially corporations, big businessmen? However, I seem to have a parallel observation. I'm noticing that media that use social media, YouTube, Instagram, etc., they can tend to take advertisements to a different level and hence reach a larger base of potential consumers. So maybe advertisements in of itself can be exploited, but is not being actually exploited by media outlets, and hence there is a need for skill development and business development in particular.
Your question is directed to who in particular? The gentleman in the middle. That's Churchill. Okay, great. There's another hand in the back row, so let's do the back and then come towards the front.
Thank you, fellow panelists. My question sort of revolves around finding models to sustain media at a national level. So obviously research tells us that, for instance, the Swedish model of funding public media has, over the decades, been cited as one of the most successful, purely because a free press and media in Sweden is a constitutional requirement as well. And the way they've done it is through a taxation, which then supports media. So any media in the country, regional papers, national papers, based on the readership, can then access that fund, which is for print support, distribution, and those kind of things. How viable do you think that could be in sort of the global south? Also tagged on that question is the East African nations. I think it was Kenya and Uganda that looked at social media tax a few years ago, but there was a huge pushback, and then I think that has stopped. But do you see that kind of social media taxation as one mechanism to promote media development and diversity.
Thank you. So Sulemana, you'll answer that, and Audrey as well. How viable is the Sweden model in Africa? We had Anya and Alison.
Thank you. Is this on, Nancy? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It's great to see everybody again, and so many themes that we've been talking about for decades of lack of advertising revenue are still here. I guess two questions. One is, what would the next steps be to bring this up to, I'm asking a procedural question, to ECOWAS or the Francophone associations? And yeah, I guess that's really my question, is the next steps. And there was something else I wanted to know, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Anya. And Lacina and Churchill will take that. And then Alison.
Thank you very much. And we're very aware of time, but I think there's so many important points that have been made, and just linking it to other things that were said. And I just kind of can't help but comment on the question about social networking taxes, which I think have just been devastating to bring, millions of people, and in fact in Uganda, these end user taxes, which are not even taxing the social media, but they're taxing these end users, have actually pushed people offline. And they're also on mobile money, by the way. And all these are essentially regressive poor taxes. So please do not use end user taxes. We need to tax, better, and it's in terms of these international regimes that are now looking at this taxation. But I wanted to respond to I think the absolutely correct observations that have been made around the marginalization of journalism in this environment, and suggest that perhaps the lack of normative consensus, amongst governments around, these assumptions around many of these international frameworks is that, there's a commitment to democratic norms. But I think, maybe if we put journalism and we put media, traditional media, and now very much online media, in broader data frameworks and digital frameworks that we've got emerging on the continent. And, I do think there are windows of opportunities around the African Continental Free Trade Area, and we've just produced the African Union Data Policy Framework, which all countries have signed up to. Is just a guidance, but it's a very progressive one. It's actually probably globally one of the more progressive guidance that we have. And sort of align ourselves in that way with some of these broader movements that are going on. And I can understand the skepticism around, working within RICS and AU. We can't even get, our participants here to get visas in time. Yet we're talking about a single market. But I think with the commitment to a digital single market attached to that market, we can really begin to look at the commitments to harmonization on the continent. And these are economically driven arguments that we simply don't get the scope and scale we need to compete at these big digital operators unless we can combine it at a continental level. And then we do have the human rights, the African Human Rights Charter, and various things, Internet Rights Charter as well, that we can then hold governments sort of feet to the fire. So I do think there is absolute need for despite our skepticism of working with these regional formations and these regional developments that they have. And to just make the final connection is that this is, as we were saying this morning, this is a globalized governance matter, and we can only deal with some of these. So although we are skeptical about some of the international efforts to do this, particularly I'm thinking of now of the UNESCO's platform guidance, platform regulation guidance that's out, and very controversially so, with, of course, all the normative assumptions that don't exist around democracies and things in our countries. But Africa's participation in particular, Global South generally, but Africa's participation in these global initiatives is absolutely minimal. And if we can just, garner some of that Pan-Africanism, that commitment that at one point there was, at a time that Africa showed leadership in these areas. That's what we have to do. Because actually, by getting those international frameworks to reflect some of the challenges that we've got here, we can also use those frameworks. I know people are concerned about those frameworks being used repressively as rubber stamping by governments, but they can also be used by activists in those countries to whole government, when they're in public processes, to say you've signed up as UNESCO member states to this, and this isn't working. It's messy and fuzzy, but I think we have to do it.
Okay, thank you. And that was more of a comment. I don't think it's a question to anybody, but we can chime in. So there's one more question? Okay, the last one for this round.
It's just really interesting. As I was listening to the panel, an email just came into my inbox inviting me, and I'm sure a number of you have got the email today, from our Film and Publications Board, which is not an independent regulator, it's an arm of government, inviting me to a meeting to set up the Digital Regulators Forum that is going to be led by our Film and Publications Board, taking place on the 4th of August. Friends, activists, fellow media people, that's really bad, because that's a few weeks away and it's being led by government, not even by independent regulators such as the information regulator or ICASA, though they're going to be there. And I think this is a prelude to South Africa wanting to play a major role in the African Digital Regulators Forum that was that COMESA for Eastern and Southern Africa has been talking about setting up. So I just wanted to put that on the agenda, not really a question so much for the panel, but just we need to be ahead of government interventions on this, not behind. We need to know what we're saying, and I just want to emphasize how important it's going to be to come out with a set of principles, Michael, working on your draft by the end of tomorrow. Principles that will apply to the big markets, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, as well as to smaller ones, as you say, the island states, Côte d'Ivoire. You were talking about how difficult it is for small economies to regulate these things on our own. But I'm very worried about developments of government saying, thank you very much, we'll take the lead on this.
Okay, thank you. And I guess the question then to TDN and to Palm is, how then do we remain ahead? Do we remain resilient, adapting to change, and, being the ones that are in the driving seat, as opposed to, governments from the example that we've just had? I think we all have questions for us. So we'll start with Churchill. There were questions for you.
Thank you. Am I still audible? Yes. I think two questions came my way. The first one from my brother at the back was to do with, if not advertising, what else? And I think there was a reference to political sponsorship and things like those. I think the key takeaway there is that we are coming off an age where most media enterprises relied on one huge revenue pipeline in the name of advertising. But in the news space, we have to learn to work with maybe multiple lines of revenues, but each of them being a lot smaller than we are used to. Calls for different ways to organize internally, calls for different ways to engage with sources of those revenues, and also calls for constant discovery as to what works for you in your individual context. So not a really straight answer, but I guess that's just part of the challenges that we have to adapt to based to the new environment and the new context that we have to work with. As to the second part of that question, whether media can extend their participation in social media to deliver value to advertisers, maybe, but always remember that the rules there are still written by the platforms and big tech essentially, and they don't have to refer to anyone, not even ourselves, as they write those rules. I'm sure colleagues in Europe and North America have recently just gone through this in fairly significant ways, where business models that were dependent on a social media discovery of new audiences suddenly stopped working because of algorithm changes. And that's, I guess, is the reality of that space. Then finally, as to the question around the next steps, this sounded more like a question for Michael, but I believe we are all invested into that question, because having taken the time to come out here, ultimately is the reality that is going to confront us tomorrow is, after all these conversations, then what? How do we still take responsibility and define a path into the future? The existing platforms such as ECOWAS, which was referenced, AU, and other multilateral organizations on the continent. Ojo here and Zoe and myself are part of a small team currently trying to consider some of these issues at a continental level. A place where we also have participation from UNESCO and the AU, and maybe that could be a place where we begin to get some answers. But I'm also aware that other organizations such as Open Society or even Hadija at the back have some new thoughts in terms of how philanthropy could come into that same space and help in first making sure that independent journalism continues to happen, but also help open our eyes towards what else might be the answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Lacina, do you want to comment on that or the next steps?
Oui, je pense que la prochaine étape et la plus urgente, c'est de tout faire pour créer une passerelle entre les GAFAM et nos différents États et organisations. Je pense que c'est urgent parce que récemment, chez moi en Côte d'Ivoire, il y a la haute autorité de la communication audiovisuelle à qui désormais la loi a donné l'attribution et la possibilité de suspendre une page d'un internaute, c'est-à-dire que sur WhatsApp, sur Facebook, etc., en cas de dérive. Et il y a une activiste ou une influenceuse qui a exposé sa nudité sur sa page Facebook. Et donc le Conseil de la haute autorité de la régulation s'est réuni et a décidé de suspendre la page méta de cette influenceuse. Et la décision a été prise assortie d'un communiqué qui a été donc publié. Malheureusement, les usagers sont allés 2 jours après sur la page est restée active. Tout simplement parce que là, c'est après que le président de l'autorité m'expliquait, ils ont eu un interlocuteur qui se disait de Facebook. Mais malheureusement, certes, a été agent de Facebook, mais qui ne l'est plus au moment des faits. Donc du coup, il n'y a pas pu avoir de réaction au niveau de Facebook à l'effet donc d'actionner la suspension de cette page. Mais tout simplement parce qu'il n'y a pas eu de bon interlocuteur de la haute autorité de la communication audiovisuelle au niveau de Facebook. Donc c'est urgent qu'il y ait une passerelle, un cadre d'échange entre les États, entre les organisations, entre les journalistes et ces GAFA. Parce que l'un des fléaux aujourd'hui, on parle de fake news, on parle de fausses informations, on parle d'autorégulation. Et nous faisons la promotion de l'autorégulation. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, dans la plupart de nos pays, nous disons que l'État veut s'immiscer dans la gestion et dans la régulation des médias à travers donc des autorités de régulation. Oui, si l'autorégulation échoue, le régulateur va rentrer en ligne de compte. Mais si nous réussissons l'étape de l'autorégulation, nous-mêmes en tant qu'acteurs, nous sommes nos propres gendarmes, nous faisons notre autorégulation, si nous réussissons, je pense que le régulateur va intervenir rarement. Donc c'est un point qui m'apparaît extrêmement important. Et pour terminer, aujourd'hui chez nous, la plupart des médias ont une page Facebook. Il y a un pendant sur les réseaux sociaux. Et justement, il y a la loi même qui fait obligation que si vous avez une page Facebook de votre média et qu'il y a un modérateur, et le modérateur va se charger de faire le tri des commentaires des internautes. Parce que quand vous publiez un article, tout de suite, un usager peut venir faire un commentaire. Mais le commentaire peut être bon, comme désobligeant, comme un discours de haine. En ce moment, le rôle du modérateur, c'est de filtrer et de supprimer. Mais il faut que ce modérateur soit journaliste, soit un professionnel du secteur. Aujourd'hui, ce sont des choses qui existent dans nos États, mais aujourd'hui, un média qui a du mal à prendre en charge déjà son fonctionnement ne va pas se payer le luxe d'aller recruter quelqu'un d'autre à l'effet de venir assurer la modération sur ses productions. Voilà ce que je voulais dire. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Lessina. To Sulemana and Ojo, there was the challenge in terms of finding ways of sustaining media and whether the Swedish model, where this is a constitutional requirement, would be viable in the global south. I think that was a question for the two of you. And Sulemana, you can go first.
I think it sounds like a really great idea. It's a model that I believe looks quite aspirational for many countries. However, the reality is that the enabling ecosystem, the enabling environment is completely different. Politically, in terms of the attitude of governments, in terms of freedoms, in terms of the pieces of legislation that exist, is completely different. In fact, we live on a continent where in many places, critical journalism, or what is actually supposed to be journalism, is sometimes treated as a crime. And so that makes it quite difficult. It's not just the political environment, but also the economic environment. You know, the Swedish economic environment, I don't think can be compared with any economy on the continent. In fact, many of us who are in the media development space would say that Sweden remains one of the biggest funders for media development work around the world. So the economic context in terms of even the capacity of people to pay based on subscriptions is different from what prevails in Africa. Then also there is the technical aspect in terms of, or technology aspect, which is also completely different. And then finally, in terms of the professional aspect, we cannot discount the fact that professionalism remains a big issue or a big challenge for the African media ecosystem. So maybe we have to adopt a gradualist approach, see the Swedish model as an aspiration, and perhaps gradually build ourselves there. But again, as I said, it will take a collective action, because maybe Ghana, with a liberal media environment, some progress could be made. Namibia, Botswana, Cape Verde, some progress could be made given the context and the environment. The same cannot be said in other repressive environments or in countries where there's currently terrorism, fundamentalism, and what they are struggling for is how to ensure national stability and peace. So the context really makes it something that I would say can only be aspirational, but cannot be a wholesale adoption for the global south.
Yeah, I think Sula and I are really aligned on this. So I'll try and refrain from repeating what is said. I think the question here is, how many countries in Africa do we perceive that we have governments that would want to give strong support to the media sector? I mean, we can honestly ask that question of ourselves, because that is really what we're talking about. Maybe I was just born cynical or suspicious, but I suspect that African governments are happier when their media are weak and dying and are not able to hold them accountable. So the idea that they would now come up with mechanisms to strengthen the media sector would be, in my view, illusory. I think we can look at the Swedish model, and I don't think that it's the only model out there that we can take from. There are other models, for instance, even the whole funding of public media in the UK, around the licensing of collection of TV licenses and so on. There have been attempts in different African countries to sort of try out many of these, but they've really been bastardized. So in Nigeria, for instance, we have a provision in our constitution that requires the government to collect licenses from owners of radio and television sets. In theory, that was supposed to go to support the media sector. But what has happened is they said local governments should collect these fees. So the local governments collect them and put the money in their pockets. The media doesn't see a dime out of it. So, I mean, they took that idea, put it in the constitution, but bastardized it such that it doesn't work for the media. And you can look at a whole range of mechanisms that they've taken that way and twisted it such that it defeats the objective. So for me, how do we get our governments to get out of the way and allow some of these initiatives to thrive? Because unfortunately, in many cases, especially if we're also talking about engaging with big tech, policy support on the part of government will be a huge factor. If we are not able to convince our governments to put appropriate policies or laws in place to support some of these initiatives, then we really would be depending on the goodwill of big tech. And unless we believe that they are angels, relying on that goodwill may just be setting yourself up for a heartbreak. So in summary, I think we should look at models around the world of different ways that media can be supported to flourish and thrive, because media really exists in the public interest. And therefore, it's important that the public also comes up with mechanisms to support the media. My final point, and this has really bothered me for a long time, the media exists to provide societies, the larger populations, with reliable news and information. But in many of our countries, we don't find public support for the media. When journalists are attacked, are arrested, are in some other way brutalized or suppressed, you never see people going on protests or riots or whatever to complain about that. The media community are just on their own, perhaps supported by civil society and some professional associations like the bar associations and so on. But among the general public, that kind of support is consistently missing. How do we galvanize our publics to recognize that the media exists in their interest and that they have a duty to also ensure the survival and flourishing of the media? I think those are some of the issues that we'll need to put in that basket as we can figure out what models will work. Thank you.
Thank you. So TDN and Pamela, try and end this panel on a more positive note. Sorry. No.
Huge task.
Huge task. In 1 minute.
Well, in terms of way forward, I totally agree with this idea. Actually, before coming here, that's something I've been thinking about. This idea of approaching the regional organizations, because it is the only way anyway we can do it if we want to succeed. Google TJMC alone, I can remember when I started putting Google ad on my website, I realized what I was in per month. I said, no, I'm doing business for Google, not getting anything. And I stopped. But if you stop, they don't care. So, but what happened in France can be a lesson. I think 300 publications in France, which is a much bigger country, came together, and they're the ones who pushed the government to vote a law in 2019 and get things done. And when Google said, okay, we're not going to be part of that conversation, the government said, no, you have to be based on European laws and other things. I don't have time to develop, but that's interesting to learn from other parts of the world what's happening. So going collectively is one. I think we need to do it. I don't know, from this conversation, we can create a task force. I don't like big organizations, a lot of bureaucracy, but just a task force whose task will be dealing with this. They're not dealing with about other issues. Media viability is a large sector, but just dealing with big tech It can stem from here. Maybe a position paper, statement, white paper, I don't know. That task force will have to push to these organizations. Then definitely we have a starting point, because the issue is, okay, we do these conversations, we end, everyone goes back home, and we have forgotten that we had discussed the serious issues. If you want to move forward, maybe from this conversation, we might have something, a group, call it whatever you want, that would have to take things further. I think that can be one point. The other thing is, let us be very careful. Our governments, when talking about dealing with these big techs, are not really interested about media viability, about high quality journalism. They're interested about their own interests, which is restricting freedom, controlling information flows, and those sort of things. So let's have that in mind and be sure that it won't be that easy. Just one example, in Senegal, it's been a decade that we're talking about access to information laws, and I'm trying to speak fast. I've seen all these signs.
Your minute is gone.
Yeah, just give me 30 seconds more if I can make it. So where we have that access to information law, which is actually a recommendation of the African Union for all countries, but we only have 26 countries that has adopted those access to information laws. And where they adopted, I heard somebody earlier this morning saying it's not operational. But so let's make sure that when we go to this, we are aware of those sort of loopholes, and we can push. Finally, let's make sure that those who want the promotion of high quality journalism, independent journalism, and when I say independent journalism, I truly mean independent journalism, not journalism supported by the state or by political parties or by political leaders, that we have, I don't know, 400, 500 media houses in the continent going together as one and saying, okay, to this task force, go and speak on our behalf. Thank you.
Thank you. Paul?
Thank you. I think just really in a nutshell, in terms of going forward, we really must agree here that most governments in the South are not friends of the media, and recognizing that we have the biggest stake in this conversation, I would just say let's start, let's begin somewhere and push this conversation as people who have a stake in democracy and who have a stake in free media. And just a quick comment on the taxation issue. I really agree with Alison that we cannot go that way, because when you look at what governments are already doing with our taxes and with public funds in regards to dangling carrots for the media organizations that will sing their song and denying advertising to the ones that will not publish content that is friendly to them, you know that if we go the way of these big techs being asked to pay taxes, that tax will still be misused to stifle democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. And I think that's all we had time for. Thank you.